Hello, students. Let us understand a very important topic now, the tongue. Some MCQs, yes, they do come in the exam from this topic of the tongue. Okay, let us understand this tongue, students. Where does the tongue lie? The tongue lies in the oral cavity, right? Now, how do we classify? How do we divide the tongue? We divide the tongue into three parts. This is what we call as the anterior two-thirds. This is anterior two-thirds of the tongue. This is the posterior one-thirds of the tongue, posterior one-thirds. And this is the posterior most part of the tongue, posterior most part. So this is anterior two-thirds of the tongue. That's a posterior one-thirds of the tongue. And that's a posterior most part of the tongue, posterior most part of the tongue. Right, anterior two-thirds, posterior one-thirds, posterior most part. What is this V-shaped sulcus? Students, what is this V-shaped sulcus known as? This is what we call as the sulcus terminalis. Sulcus terminalis. Okay, V-shaped sulcus is the sulcus terminalis. And what is this foramen that we get here? That's the foramen cecum. You remember there was one foramen cecum in the skull also. Foramen cecum, right? So the tongue is divided into an anterior two-thirds, posterior one-thirds, and the posterior most part of the tongue. It is divided by a V-shaped sulcus terminalis, whose center is the foramen cecum. Now, this posterior one-thirds of the tongue, students, contains lymphoid tissues. Posterior one-thirds contains lymphoid tissues. So this is acting as a lingual tonsil. Okay, that's a lingual tonsil, right? It contains lymphoid tissues. Now, anterior two-thirds of the tongue, the surface is rough because of the presence of papillae. Now, there are four types of papillae: filiform, fungiform, foliate, and the largest of all, circumvallate papillae. Circumvallate, right? And we get this circumvallate papillae right in front of the sulcus terminalis. We get this large circumvallate papillae in front of the sulcus terminalis, and this circumvallate papillae will have taste buds in them. Taste buds. Right, filiform, fungiform, foliate, and circumvallate, which are the largest, which have taste buds in them. And the epithelium of this papillae is stratified squamous keratinized. Right, so that's about the tongue. Now we come to the muscles of the tongue. Muscles. Now, how do we classify the muscles of the tongue? Muscles of the tongue are divided into two parts. One which are within the tongue. Within the tongue, we call them as intrinsic. They lie within the tongue, and they're going to change the shape of the tongue, roll the tongue like that. And the other one is coming from outside. Extrinsic muscle. So intrinsic muscle and extrinsic muscles. Which are the intrinsic muscles? See, if I draw the tongue here for you, that's the tongue here which we have drawn. There's a muscle here on the superior surface. It's a longitudinal muscle. That's a superior longitudinal. There's a muscle here on the inferior surface, which is a longitudinal muscle. So one is the superior longitudinal. One is inferior longitudinal. Okay. One is a muscle like this, like this, like this. What do you call this muscle? As vertical. Vertical. And the last muscle is like this. Look, the muscle is, that's the tongue, and there's a muscle which goes on either sides like this. Either sides. What do you call this? As transverse. Transverse muscle, right? So which are the intrinsic muscles of the tongue? The superior longitudinal, the inferior longitudinal, the vertical muscle, and the transverse muscle. So these are the intrinsic muscles. What about the extrinsic muscles? Extrinsic muscles, yes, they do come from outside the tongue, right? So one is coming from the styloid process. That's the styloid process to the tongue, styloglossus, styloglossus. One comes from the palate. Yes, palatoglossus. One is the palatoglossus. The next comes from the hyoid bone. What is that? Hyoglossus. Right. One comes from the mandible. There's a genial tubercle on the mandible. That's the genioglossus. Genioglossus. Okay, so styloglossus, palatoglossus, hyoglossus, and genioglossus. out of all this extrinsic muscle, which is the main, which is the muscle forming the main bulk of the tongue? The main bulk of the tongue, that is the genioglossus. The genioglossus begins from the genial tubercle of the mandible and goes into the tongue. This muscle is going to form the main bulk of the tongue, and this genioglossus is going to protrude the tongue. It protrudes the tongue. Now, if this genioglossus is paralyzed, the tongue falls back and the person will die because of choking. So genioglossus is also known as, yes, that's a very important MCQ. Genioglossus is known as the safety muscle of the tongue. Okay, safety muscle of the tongue is genioglossus. Remember this, because it protrudes the tongue, right? It protrudes the tongue, so it prevents the blocking of airway. So genioglossus is known as the safety muscle of the tongue. Just remember this. Now, all these muscles, intrinsic and extrinsic muscles, all these muscles are supplied by hypoglossal nerve. Hypoglossal nerve. Remember, these muscles of the tongue are derived from occipital myotomes. And what is the functional component which the hypoglossal nerve should have to supply the muscles of the tongue? That's the general somatic efferent component. Remember, general somatic efferent component, this is the component which supplies the muscles derived from occipital myotomes. The muscles of the tongue are derived from occipital myotomes. Which other muscles? Yes, extraocular. Very good students. Excellent. The second group of muscles is the extraocular muscles. So what is the functional component? General somatic efferent. And what is the name of the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve to supply the muscles of the tongue? Hypoglossal nucleus. The name of the nucleus is hypoglossal nucleus. Fine. So all these muscles of the tongue are supplied by hypoglossal nerve. All the muscles of the tongue are supplied by hypoglossal nerve except palatoglossus. Palatoglossus is also muscle of the soft palate. You remember all the muscles of soft palate were supplied by what? Pharyngeal plexus. Okay, except palatoglossus, which is supplied by pharyngeal plexus. Otherwise, all the muscles of the tongue are supplied by hypoglossal nerve except palatoglossus, which is supplied by pharyngeal plexus. Clear, students? Clear to all of you? So that's about the tongue. Look at this. Okay, so what is this muscle which is beginning from the genial tubercle and which is going into the tongue? That's the genioglossus, that's the hyoglossus, that's the styloglossus here, and that's the palatoglossus here. Fine, so this is about the tongue, muscles of the tongue, the same muscles here. Yes, answer this MCQ. Which of the following muscle is known as the life-saving muscle of the tongue? Yes, that's the genioglossus. Why is genioglossus known as life-saving muscle? Because it protrudes the tongue. It prevents the falling back of the tongue. It is therefore known as the life-saving muscle of the tongue. Now, what is the action of genioglossus? Genioglossus protrudes the tongue. Okay, it protrudes the tongue. Genioglossus is going to protrude the tongue. It protrudes the tongue to the opposite side. It protrudes the tongue to opposite side. Understand this, students. That's a very important MCQ. That means the right genioglossus is going to protrude the tongue to the left. And the left genioglossus is going to protrude the tongue to the right side. Clear? Opposite side. The right genioglossus will protrude the tongue to the left and the left to the right. Now suppose if the right hypoglossal nerve is damaged. Which muscle is paralyzed? The right genioglossus is paralyzed. Right hypoglossal nerve gone. The right genioglossus is paralyzed. The right genioglossus is paralyzed. The left becomes powerful and the left is going to deviate the tongue to the right side. You clear? Right hypoglossal nerve gone. Right genioglossus gone. The left becomes powerful and the left will deviate the tongue to the right side, and thus in lesions of hypoglossal nerve, the tongue is deviated to the same side of lesion. Is this clear? Because genioglossus protrudes the tongue to the opposite side. So in lesions of hypoglossal nerve, remember the students, this is a very important MCQ. In lesions of hypoglossal nerve, the tongue is deviated to same side of lesion. Tongue is deviated to the same side of lesion. Clear? So in lesions of hypoglossal nerve, the tongue is deviated to the same side of lesion. That's a very important MCQ. Students, just try to understand this. Okay, answer this. Paralysis of right genioglossus will cause deviation of the tongue to the right side. Tongue is deviated to the same side. So paralysis of right genioglossus will deviate the tongue to the right side. Perfect. Clear to all of you? Okay. Now understand this. Look, that's the tongue. The tip of the tongue, this is the tip of the tongue, drains into which lymph nodes is this? Submental lymph nodes. Tip of the tongue drains into the submental lymph nodes. The middle part, that's the middle part of the tongue, drains into, what is this group of lymph nodes? That's a submandibular. The middle part of the tongue drains into the submandibular lymph nodes. And the posterior part of the tongue drains into, yes, this is the jugulo-omohyoid lymph nodes. Jugulo-omohyoid lymph nodes. Just remember this, the cancer of the tongue is spreading very fast. The tip drains into the submental lymph nodes, the middle part drains into the submandibular lymph nodes, and the posterior part of the tongue drains into the jugulodigastric lymph nodes. Clear? So that's about the tongue. Now coming to the sensory nerve supply of the tongue. Motor nerve supply we have seen. Understand the sensory nerve supply of the tongue. Now sensory nerve supply, we divide it into general sensations and special sensations. That's the general sensations. What are general sensations? That's the touch, pain, temperature. And special sensations is what? Taste. Special sensation is the taste. Okay, general sensation and special sensation. General sensation is touch, pain, temperature. Special sensation is taste. Now we start with anterior 2/3, posterior 1/3, and the posterior most part. So now students, tell me, anterior 2/3 of the tongue is supplied by what? Any guesses? Anterior 2/3 of the tongue is supplied by general sensations. It is supplied by lingual. You remember this? Lingual nerve, we have seen the mandibular nerve. You remember mandibular nerve? It's a branch of mandibular nerve which is supplying the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. That's lingual nerve. And this lingual nerve was joined by a nerve. Which was that nerve which was joining the lingual nerve? Chorda tympani. So special sensations are supplied by chorda tympani, which is a branch of facial nerve. Chorda tympani nerve, which is a branch of facial nerve. So anterior 2/3 general sensations, lingual. Special sensations is chorda tympani, branch of facial. Posterior 1/3, both general and special sensation, is glossopharyngeal nerve. Posterior 1/3. General and special sensation is glossopharyngeal nerve, and the posterior most part of the tongue, both general and special sensation, is internal laryngeal nerve. Internal laryngeal nerve, that's a branch of superior laryngeal, which is a branch of vagus. So posterior most part of the tongue, both general and special sensation, is supplied by internal laryngeal nerve, which is a branch of superior laryngeal, which is a branch of vagus. So that's the sensory nerve supply of the tongue. Remember, this is very important. Motor nerve supply is hypoglossal nerve, except palatoglossus, which is supplied by pharyngeal plexus. Clear, students? Right. Now coming to the development of tongue. So answer this MCQ. Tip of the tongue drains into. Yes, the tip of the tongue drains into. Your answer is the submental group of lymph nodes. Submental group of lymph nodes. Clear? Okay. Now understand, in short, I'll tell you the development of tongue. Development of tongue. This is a section taken through the neck. A section taken like this. What is this? From outside ectoderm. From inside, that's the endoderm. That's the GIT, right? So this is going to be the GIT. So what is this from inside? That's the endoderm here. And what is this from outside? That's the ectoderm here. Ectoderm, correct? Now, so we call this as, look at this. What do we call this as? We call this as the endodermal cleft. Endodermal, sorry, these are the endodermal pouches. I'm so sorry. So from inside, these are the endodermal pouch. And from outside, these are the ectodermal clefts. clefts, clefts, clefts. We'll see this in the lecture later, development of head and neck. So from inside, these are the pouches here, pouches, and what are these? Ectodermal clefts. Right. And when we join this, we get one pharyngeal arch. This is one pharyngeal arch, second pharyngeal arch, third, fourth, and sixth pharyngeal arches. So these are the pharyngeal arches. To begin with, there are six. One, the fifth disappears. So now there are five pharyngeal arches. Five pharyngeal arches. Just understand this development of tongue. I'll start with this development of tongue. Have a look at this. So from outside, what do you call this as? Ectodermal cleft. Cleft, 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 cleft. And what is this? Endodermal pouches, 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 pouches. Endodermal pouches, 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 and ectodermal cleft, 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 cleft. So this becomes one pharyngeal arch, second pharyngeal arch, third pharyngeal, fourth pharyngeal, and sixth pharyngeal arches, right? Now this we'll study later in the embryology later. Now, in the first pharyngeal arch, we get two swellings here. We get two swellings here and we get a swelling behind. What are these two swellings known as? Lingual swellings. Lingual swellings. These two swellings are known as lingual swellings. And what is this one swelling behind here? This swelling is known as the tuberculum impar. Tuberculum impar. The two lingual swellings and tuberculum impar are derived from the first pharyngeal arch. These two lingual swellings and tuberculum impar are going to form the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. Anterior two-thirds of the tongue. So anterior two-thirds of the tongue is derived from the first pharyngeal arch. So anterior two-thirds of the tongue is supplied by the nerve, the first pharyngeal arch. That's the mandibular nerve. It's a branch of mandibular nerve. That's the lingual. I hope this is clear. Yeah, so that's the anterior two-thirds. In the third and the fourth arch, we get a prominence here. In the third and the fourth arch, we get a prominence here. This is what is known as the hypobranchial eminence. Hypobranchial eminence, or this is also known as the cupula. C-O-P-U-L-A. Hypobranchial eminence or cupula in the third and the fourth arches. This divides into a cranial part. In the third arch is the cranial and this is the caudal part. Okay, so the cranial part of hypobranchial eminence forms what? The posterior one-thirds of the tongue. Cranial part of hypobranchial eminence forms the posterior one-thirds of the tongue. Which arch is that? Third arch. Which is the nerve of the third arch? Glossopharyngeal nerve. So posterior one-thirds of the tongue is therefore supplied by glossopharyngeal nerve. Glossopharyngeal nerve. And what is this? What do you call this as? This is what we call as the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence, right? That's the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence that forms the posterior most part of the tongue. The caudal part forms the posterior most part of the tongue and epiglottis. That's the epiglottis. Epiglottis. So the caudal part of hypobranchial eminence, this is the cranial part. I'll write this as the cranial part of hypobranchial eminence and the caudal part of hypobranchial eminence. So the cranial part forms the posterior one-thirds and the caudal part forms the posterior most part of the tongue and the epiglottis, right? So the nerve of the fourth arch is superior laryngeal. Superior laryngeal divides into an external laryngeal and internal laryngeal. The external laryngeal is going to supply the cricothyroid muscle. The internal laryngeal nerve supplies the sensory supply of the larynx above the vocal folds. It also supplies the posterior most part of the tongue and the epiglottis, right? Clear to all of you? So I'll just write this down for you so it will be clear to you. I hope this is clear. So anterior two-thirds of the tongue, we'll just mention this, anterior two-thirds of the tongue is derived from two lingual swellings and tuberculum impar. Just remember, this comes in the MCQs. Anterior two-thirds, posterior one-thirds. Posterior one-thirds is derived from the cranial part of hypobranchial eminence. I'll just write it in short, hypobranchial eminence or cupula. Cranial part of the hypobranchial eminence or cupula. posterior most part of the tongue is derived from caudal part of hypobranchial eminence, right? Right. So the nerve, the first arch, lingual, supplies the anterior 2/3. Third arch, glossopharyngeal, posterior 1/3. Fourth arch is superior laryngeal. A branch of superior laryngeal, that's the internal laryngeal, supplies the posterior most part of the tongue. Is this clear, students? The nerve supply of the tongue. I hope this is clear to all of you. And the development of tongue. So anterior 2/3 of the tongue is derived from two lingual swellings and tuberculum impar. That's in the first arch. The posterior 1/3 is derived from the cranial part of hypobranchial eminence, and the posterior most part is derived from the caudal part of the hypobranchial eminence. This is the structure of the tongue. The muscles of the tongue are derived from the occipital myotomes, and that's how the hypoglossal nerve from the occiput comes down to supply the tongue. Once again, what is the name of the functional component which is going to supply the muscles derived from occipital myotomes? General somatic efferent. So what component will the hypoglossal nerve have in its nucleus? General somatic efferents. And what is the name of the nucleus of hypoglossal nerve which is going to supply these muscles? The hypoglossal nucleus. So that's how you come to the hypoglossal nerve. Clear, students? Is this clear to all of you? Right? I'll just tell you in short one small flow chart that you need to know. Okay. Okay. Look, you've got this vagus nerve. Vagus. Now, vagus gives two main branches. One is the superior laryngeal nerve. And the other one is the recurrent laryngeal nerve. Superior laryngeal nerve is a nerve 4th pharyngeal arch, and the recurrent laryngeal nerve is a nerve 6th pharyngeal arch. Okay, recurrent laryngeal is a nerve 6th pharyngeal arch. Superior laryngeal divides into an external laryngeal nerve and an internal laryngeal nerve. External laryngeal, internal laryngeal. External laryngeal nerve is going to supply the cricothyroid muscle. Right, we have seen this in the larynx. So the external laryngeal nerve supplies the cricothyroid muscle, which is a tensor of the vocal cords. It's a tensor of vocal cords. That's external laryngeal. Internal laryngeal nerve first pierces. That's a very important MCQ. Pierces the thyrohyoid membrane. I've shown you this in the last lecture. Pierces the thyrohyoid membrane, then passes between. Yes. Answer this. Pierces the thyroid membrane that passes between the middle constrictor and inferior constrictor. We've seen this now. First pierces the thyroid membrane, then goes between the middle and the inferior constrictor. And what does it supply? The sensory supply above the vocal cords. Okay, it supplies the sensory above the vocal cords. Sensory supply of the larynx above the vocal cords. Are you able to follow this, students? So the internal laryngeal nerve first pierces the thyroid membrane, comes inside, then passes between what? The middle constrictor and the inferior constrictor, and then supplies. Now it is inside the larynx. It's inside the hypopharynx. Then it goes to the larynx, supplies the sensory supply of the larynx above the vocal cords. It also supplies the posterior most part of the tongue and the epiglottis. Fine. Now what does the recurrent laryngeal nerve do? Recurrent laryngeal nerve supplies a sensory supply. Okay, sensory below the vocal cords. It's sensory below the vocal cords. And it supplies all the muscles of the larynx, except cricothyroid. All the muscles of the larynx except the cricothyroid. Clear? So that's a flowchart of vagus. Just remember this flowchart. Plenty of MCQs will be answered with this flowchart. Okay, once again, I'll just repeat this. So vagus gives two main branches. One is the superior laryngeal, which is a nerve of the fourth arch. Recurrent, which is a nerve of the sixth arch. Superior further divides into an external, internal. External laryngeal nerve supplies the cricothyroid muscle, a tensor of the vocal cords. Internal laryngeal nerve pierces the thyroid membrane, now goes inside between the middle and the inferior constrictor, enters the hypopharynx, then goes to the larynx, supplies the sensory supply of the larynx above the vocal cords. We go up, up, up. We come to the epiglottis. In front of the epiglottis is the posterior most part of the tongue, which is also supplied by internal laryngeal. The recurrent laryngeal nerve sixth arch supplies the sensory supply below the vocal cords. It also supplies all the muscles of the larynx except cricothyroid. I hope this is clear. Students, the tongue is clear to all of you. This flowchart is clear to all of you. I hope this development of the tongue is also clear. What is this from outside? These are the ectodermal clefts. From inside, those are the endodermal pouches. We join this, we get pharyngeal arches. I told you each pharyngeal arch has got a nerve of its own. There are muscles which are derived from the pharyngeal arches, and the nerve is going to supply those muscles of the pharyngeal arches. And to supply the muscles of the pharyngeal arches, what is the name of the component which the nerve should have in its nucleus? Yes, that's the special visceral efferent component. Special visceral efferent. Remembering this? So if a nerve has to supply the muscles of the pharyngeal arches, it should have this component, special visceral efferent component. So this component would be present in which nerves? The nerves of the pharyngeal arches. First arch is mandibular nerve, second arch is facial nerve, third arch is glossopharyngeal nerve, and fourth and sixth arch is vagus. Vagus. Right? So this special visceral efferent component is going to be present in 5th, 7th, 9th and 10th cranial nerves. And what is the corresponding nucleus? So the 5th nerve supplies the muscles of the first arch. What is the name of the nucleus of the 5th nerve to supply the muscles? That's the motor nucleus of trigeminal nerve. The nucleus of facial nerve, the motor nucleus of facial nerve. And for the 9th, 10th and the cranial accessory, there's a common nucleus, that is the nucleus ambiguus. And this nucleus ambiguus is going to supply the muscles of the 4th, the 3rd, 4th and the 6th arches. Students, I hope this is all clear to you. I mean, I just did a quick revision because that functional component is a difficult chapter and you just have to revise this to understand the nerves, the functional components of the nucleus and the nuclei of the cranial nerve. Students, thank you for your patient listening. Thank you so much and happy learning.